The lake had always been my escape. Tucked between a dense pine grove and the still waters of Grand Hollow Lake, my cabin wasn't much, a wooden porch sagging in the middle, faded green shutters, and a crooked mailbox that looked like it had survived a war. But it was mine. And for years, it was the only place where the world stopped spinning. That Saturday morning, I arrived with nothing but a backpack, a fishing rod, and an ice chest full of beer and sandwich meat. No Wi-Fi. No deadlines. Just the slow rhythm of cicadas and the breeze whispering through the trees. But then she showed up. Marlene Preston, president of the Lakewood Homeowners Association. In theory, HOA presidents weren't supposed to have authority over private lakefront properties. But Marlene never let that stop her. She ruled like a dictator in a pantsuit, clipboard always in hand, lips puckered like she'd just sucked a lemon, and a voice that made car alarms sound soothing. I was unloading the back of my truck when her car, a glossy silver SUV with a vanity plate that read H0 a Queen, pulled up uninvited. Her engine barely cut off before she flung the door open and stomped across the gravel, heels crunching like snapping bones. She didn't even greet me. "Why is your cabin locked?" she snapped. I blinked. "Because it's my cabin." She rolled her eyes like I was a child. "You're ruining the flow of the lakeside. We have guests arriving in 2 hours, and your property is an eyesore." I laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. "You're joking." Marlene didn't laugh. She pulled out her clipboard like it was a badge. "You may not be part of the Lakewood HOA officially, but you're still within the influence zone. Your cabin's proximity affects the aesthetic value of the surrounding community." The influence zone? That's not a thing. She lifted her chin. "It is now." I turned my back to her and started hauling a bag of charcoal onto the porch. "Look, I didn't drive 4 hours to be part of some neighborhood scavenger hunt. Go throw your party somewhere else. You'll regret this," she hissed, eyes narrowing like a hawk that just spotted prey. I shrugged. "Already do." She stormed off. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. That night, I spotted something strange. Around 10 p.m., I went outside to lock up the storage shed when I noticed 2 silhouettes creeping around the side of my cabin. One of them held a flashlight. The other was carrying bolt cutters. I stepped quietly off the porch and grabbed the metal rake leaning against the railing. My boots crunched the gravel just enough for them to freeze. "Can I help you?" I asked, stepping into view. The flashlight snapped in my direction, blinding me for a second. Then they ran. "Hey!" I shouted, chasing after them. But they were fast. I followed their footsteps around the side of the cabin just in time to see them jump into a golf cart and zip away into the night. My heart was pounding. I stood there in the dark, rake still in hand, breath fogging in the cool air. This was no misunderstanding. This was war. The next morning, I stood on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But the truth was sitting right there on the ground, 2 fresh boot prints in the dirt, less than 10 feet from my door. Someone had tried to break into my cabin. And I had a pretty good idea who sent them. I called the sheriff's office. When Deputy Logan arrived an hour later, his cruiser kicking up dust as it rolled into the driveway, I was halfway through replacing my old padlock with a deadbolt. He stepped out, squinting into the sunlight. "Morning. Heard there was an attempted break-in?" "Yeah," I said, holding up the bolt cutters I'd found tossed under a bush. 2 people, around 10 p.m. last night. Tried to cut their way in." He scratched his neck and looked around. "Any damage?" "Not yet. But it's escalating. I think Marlene Preston is behind it." Logan winced like I'd just cursed in front of his mother. "Marlene, huh? Well, she runs a tight ship. She tried to commandeer my property yesterday for a party I didn't agree to," I said. "Now strangers are trying to force entry. You think that's a coincidence?" He sighed. "Look, I'm not saying it's okay, but maybe just try to keep the peace. Everyone's a little high-strung during these community events. She's not my community. Still, this is a tight-knit area. You don't want to be the guy everyone thinks is difficult. I leaned in, lowered my voice. I'm not difficult. I'm just not a doormat. Logan didn't write a report. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and told me to be neighborly. As he drove off, I watched the dust settle and knew this wouldn't end with one confrontation. Marlene wasn't just throwing a party. She was trying to claim territory. That afternoon, I walked down to the mailbox. Tucked between ads and bills was a bright orange envelope stamped "Urgent HOA violation." My eyebrows shot up. I wasn't even part of the HOA. I ripped it open. Failure to maintain appearance of dwelling during community engagement weekend. Penalty, $1,250. Compliance deadline, immediate. I laughed out loud. Then I checked the envelope again. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Lakewood Community Guest Housing Unit B. She had renamed my home. It got worse. Around dusk, I took a walk down to the general store by the lake. On the way back, I overheard a group of strangers unloading suitcases near the parking lot. One of them pointed at my cabin and said, "That's the place Marlene said we'd be staying." Rustic charm, right? "Wait," said a woman in yoga pants. "Is this the cabin on the listing? The one with the vintage fireplace and private dock?" My stomach dropped. When I got back, I went online using the hotspot on my phone and searched the major vacation rental sites. There it was. Lakewood Retreat, private cabin with lakeside access. Photos of my porch. My dock. My freaking hammock. Listed by Marlene P_property manager. She was renting out my cabin. She hadn't just overstepped. She had trespassed on reality. I locked the driveway gate. Then I posted a sign. "No trespassing. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." But I knew this wasn't about renting a cabin. This was about control. And Marlene wasn't done yet. By Monday morning, it was no longer subtle. Two men in orange vests and matching caps walked briskly up to the edge of my flower bed and drove a bright plastic flag into the soil. It flapped obnoxiously in the breeze like a threat written in plastic: HOA violation, landscaping non-compliant. My jaw clenched. I stepped off the porch. "Can I help you?" I asked. The younger of the two glanced at a clipboard. "You've been cited for improper landscaping maintenance." "This isn't HOA land," I said. "This is my property." They shrugged. "We're just following orders from President Preston." "Tell President Preston she's trespassing on private ground." "Sir," the older one said calmly, "she says this property has historical association value and falls under advisory jurisdiction." "What the hell does that even mean?" He smiled faintly, like he'd already heard that question 5 times today. "It means she's trying to absorb your cabin into HOA oversight. Retroactively." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just watched as they turned and walked away like bureaucratic phantoms, leaving chaos in their wake. That evening, my Aunt Rosa called. "You didn't tell me you're building a condo resort," she said flatly. "Excuse me?" She sighed. "Marlene's been telling everyone you plan to bulldoze the cabin and turn the shoreline into a luxury timeshare. It's all over the community Facebook group." My head started to throb. "That's a lie." "I know that. But people are scared. They think you're going to change the lake forever." I ended the call with a knot in my chest. That's when I knew Marlene was playing the long game. If she couldn't steal my property outright, she'd steal my reputation, inch by inch. So I did what I had to do. I went into town and bought floodlights, motion detectors, a camera system, and new security locks. I wired the cabin like it was a military outpost. Every window was reinforced. Every entry point covered. Let her try. 3 days later, I received a legal-looking envelope, one of those thick ones that carries bad news like a virus. Inside, a mandatory mediation summons signed by a regional compliance officer. The HOA was demanding my attendance to resolve regional disputes and compliance concerns in good faith. I threw it in the fire pit. And still, they came. A woman in a navy suit and an HOA badge, someone I hadn't seen before, was caught by my cameras snooping around the back of my cabin, snapping photos of my shed. That night, I didn't sleep. I compiled everything: camera footage, voice memos, printed violation slips, screenshots of the fake rental listing. I even included screenshots of Facebook comments from neighbors asking why I was greedy enough to rent out a family heritage home to strangers. I was going to take her down. But I wasn't the only one she'd targeted. A day later, I got a knock at the cabin door. It was a man in his 70s, tall and wiry with white stubble and eyes like polished glass. "You're him," he said. "The cabin guy." "I guess so," I replied cautiously. He stepped forward. "I'm Ben. Lived here since '81. Marlene fined me $800 last month for painting my mailbox red." "Red?" She said it wasn't neighborhood compliant. He glanced around, then said, "She's done this to others too. If you're building a case, I think we'd like to help." By nightfall, 7 neighbors were in my living room, drinking tea, comparing horror stories, and whispering like we were in the middle of a rebellion. Because we were. By the end of the week, I had a full folder of documentation, photos, voice recordings, statements from neighbors, and most damning of all, a printed-out PDF of Marlene's illegal cabin listing, complete with her fake host profile and bank routing details. She was collecting money from guests who thought they were paying for my property. I also had a plan. But Marlene wasn't finished. Not even close. 3 more violation notices arrived over the next 2 days. Each one more ridiculous than the last. Use of unauthorized curtains. Failure to adhere to HOA seasonal decoration guidelines. Improper hammock positioning. She'd turned petty harassment into an art form. And then came the forged document. It was slipped under my door like a ransom note, printed on faux letterhead, claiming that my land was subject to Section 6, Subset 12 of a fictional community easement ordinance. According to the document, the HOA now had partial administrative authority over my property for communal benefit. I scanned it, cross-referenced local property laws, and confirmed what I already suspected: it was utter nonsense. But it had Marlene's fingerprints all over it. It was no longer about rules or property lines. It was about power. And the illusion of power is often more dangerous than the real thing. That weekend, her event began. Cars pulled up in waves. Dozens of people spilled out, wearing polos and lake hats, carrying coolers and wine bottles, smiling like they were walking into a summer fantasy. Marlene stood at the entrance to the lakeside park she decorated with banners that read, "Welcome to Lakewood Lakeside Retreat." She even had a tent set up near my fence, with a sign that read, "Check-in, cabin guests only." They still thought they were staying in my home. So I waited. Let it all pile up. That night, as guests drank under string lights and music echoed across the water, I quietly activated the motion lights around my cabin and posted laminated signs every 20 feet along my property line. Private property. Owner not affiliated with Lakewood Retreat. Trespassing will result in police involvement. I could hear the murmur ripple through the crowd like a bad smell. People were confused. Whispers spread. A woman approached the check-in tent and asked, "Wait, who owns the cabin?" Marlene stammered something about shared management agreements and a community-based trust system. But it was unraveling fast. And then the deputy returned. Different one this time. Older. Wiser. Worn boots and a badge that had seen more than bake sale disputes. He walked up to me with a notepad. "Got complaints about property fraud and event mismanagement," he said. "Guests are saying they were promised a cabin that doesn't belong to the host." I handed him the file. Everything. He flipped through it for 5 minutes in silence, lips pursed. When he finally looked up, his voice was dry. "She's in trouble." I didn't smile. I just nodded. "It's time." Monday morning came like Judgment Day. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp, held in the rec center beside the tennis courts. It was the only place in Lakewood with enough folding chairs and passive-aggressive energy to contain what was about to happen. I arrived early, dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt. I brought my evidence in a manila folder, and behind me, Ben, Rosa, and 4 more neighbors. We sat together, silent but solid. Marlene swept in 5 minutes late, flanked by her usual yes men, and pretending nothing was wrong. She wore a coral blazer and pearls, her HOA badge clipped to her lapel like a crown. But the smugness was thinner this time, cracked around the edges. When the board chair asked if anyone had any concerns to raise before the next vote on summer bylaws, I stood up. "Yes," I said. "I'd like the board to review a comprehensive file detailing fraudulent listings, unlawful citations, and targeted harassment carried out by President Marlene Preston." Marlene scoffed. "This is highly irregular." The chair raised a hand. "He has the floor." I walked to the front and passed out copies of the file. One for every board member. One for the deputy sheriff seated in the back. Then I spoke, calmly, clearly, and with the weight of weeks behind me. I told them about the fake listing. The false citations. The attempt to break into my cabin. The made-up HOA laws, the lies to my neighbors, the illegal use of HOA funds to host an unapproved event. Then I handed the final piece of evidence to the deputy, the forged property claim document, with Marlene's digital signature embedded in the metadata. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman on the board leaned forward. "Did you forge a claim to this man's land, Marlene?" Marlene's face flushed. "He's manipulating this. He's always been a disruption. He doesn't even belong to our HOA," another board member muttered. "Exactly," she shrieked. "That's the problem. He's been poisoning our community from the outside." That did it. The chair of the board cleared his throat. I motioned to vote on the immediate removal of Marlene Preston from the position of HOA president, pending full investigation. Hands went up, every single one. Unanimous. Marlene stood frozen, mouth agape, as if the crown had just fallen from her head and shattered at her feet. "You can't do this," she whispered. But it was already done. The deputy approached her and quietly began asking questions as the rest of us filtered out into the sunlight. "Would you like me to continue with Part 6 and move toward the resolution of the story?" Part 6, Peace at the Cabin. The days that followed felt like the storm had passed. For the first time in weeks, the air around Grand Hollow Lake was still, like the place had been holding its breath and finally let it out. The orange flags disappeared from my yard. The fake rental listing was taken down. And most importantly, no one from the HOA dared set foot on my property again. Marlene. She faded like a bad smell on a windy day. Rumor had it she moved out of the Lakewood community within a month, her name erased from the HOA site, her badge revoked. The new HOA president was a soft-spoken retired schoolteacher named Helen Griffin, who showed up at my porch one sunny afternoon with a pie in hand and an olive branch in her smile. "I'd like to start fresh," she said. I nodded and took the pie. "As long as you stay on that side of the fence, we'll get along just fine." We both laughed. Later that week, I hosted a small get-together. Not a party. Just a fire pit, a few chairs, some grilled fish, and the people who had stood beside me when things got rough. Ben brought his harmonica. My Aunt Rosa brought her husband and a tray of tamales. We shared stories, laughter, and something that had been missing for a long time, trust. Near the end of the night, one of the neighbors stood and lifted a glass. "To the man who said no." I laughed and raised mine in return. "To everyone who finally said no." There was applause, not loud, but full of warmth. When the last guest left and the stars came out, I sat alone on the porch and looked across the water. The cabin looked smaller now, not in size, but in burden. I had protected something that mattered. Not just property, but peace. Boundaries. Respect. Things Marlene had tried to erase. I stood and mounted a new sign on the gate. Not a warning. Just a truth. Private, but welcome, respect goes both ways. Weeks passed. Then months. One morning, I noticed a kid skipping stones near the shoreline with his dad. I waved. They waved back. That was how it should be. Not walls. Not orders. Just neighbors. The lake had found its voice again, and this time, it was quiet. Exactly the way I liked it.